So welcome everyone, good afternoon. I am Chris Cain, Executive Director of CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Fall Protection Expert Question and Answer Panel. This is the third panel CPWR has done with members of the Ansi ASSP Z359 Committee, and we're excited to have them back to answer more of your questions on fall protection. During this panel, we'll be hearing from Thom Kramer, Principal of LJB Incorporated and Chair of the Ansi ASSP Z359 Full Committee. Dan Henn, VP of Operations at Reliance Fall Protection and Vice Chair of the Z359 Full Committee, as well as Chair of the Z359.14 Subcommittee. Adam Rubin, Vice President of Safety at Buckeye Partners LP and Vice Chair of the Ansi ASSP Z359.14 Subcommittee. And lastly, Mike Dickerson, Safety Consultant at American Contractors Insurance Group and a member of the Ansi ASSP Z359 Full Committee. We're pleased to have us with them today, as today marks the second day of this week's National Stand Down to Prevent Falls in Construction. The Stand Down is the main event in the CPWR NIOSH OSHA year-round falls campaign and aims to provide an opportunity for employers and their workers to pause and focus on fall safety. To support contractors and owners and everyone in the industry who's holding events and strengthening their fall prevention programs, CPWR maintains the fall campaign website at stopconstructionfalls.com. It's got an incredible amount of free resources in both English and Spanish. The resources include videos, training programs, job site posters, useful tools to prevent or to support the planning for fall prevention, protection, and rescue. CPWR also puts out a list of stand-down activity ideas and social media guide for the week. Jessica will drop in some of the links into the chat for you to check out. And now I'm going to hand it over to Thom to lead us through our Q&A panel. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thank you, Jessica, for doing everything you're doing in the background and also to arrange this session. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your busy day. We'll get to having the folks on the panel discussion, give them a little bit more, 30 seconds for an introduction as they get into their first question, but we'll get into a couple of slides here and then share that. Just want to say, again, thank you for CPWR for all that you and your team do, Jess and Chris, really to allow us to work smarter in this industry. I think everyone is doing everything they can to drive down these numbers. And so everyone's working very, very hard, but through your analysts and through all your professionals there at CPWR, you're helping us work smarter, and we really greatly appreciate that and appreciate the partnership. As you can see, the panelists all offer to put their email address on the screen. We want to be your phone of friends when it comes to fall protection. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get to every question today that you've asked and so forth, and we see that a couple have come in already. But we want to make sure that we're available to answer any questions in order to help better protect your workers at height. And this is really the reason why we're doing it. And when you look at the statistics, these are the total fall fatalities. Now, these are all industries, not just construction, where CPWR they're helping kind of look at all the data for all the industries. But this is the data when it comes to falls from heights. And when we look at this, we can see that even despite all of our regulations, all of our standards, all the money that we've invested in fall protection being the #1 citation, and overall workplace fatalities decreasing, fall fatalities continue to be high. And so that's what we're talking about today is how we can, utilizing the Ansi Z359 standards and other best practices, help you better protect your workers. Related to Z359, we are proud that we published 4 specific standards when it comes to working at heights just last year, and we have a pipeline full of new standards coming out to make sure that the folks out in the field have these state-of-the-art best protect them. We're going to focus just on 2 of those real briefly in this introduction before we get to the Q&A. Just get a little background and hopefully what your appetite as far as other questions So first off, we have Ansi Z359.14, and that is the standard on self-retracting devices. Dan is the chair of that standard, and Adam is the vice chair. It went into effect back on August 1st. Dan, I did not get that updated time that was revised based on the request from the the International Safety Equipment Association. What is the revised effective date? Z359.14 standard.
Yeah, the revised effective date will be for February of 2023.
February 2020. Thanks for sharing that. And Dan can get into more about the different types of self-retracting devices, and you see all of them here on this screen where we have the traditional self-retracting device. We have the self-retracting device that has a integral rescue hoist into it, and then also what we've clarified in our standard is what we call self-retracting devices that are personal, or the personal SRL, the one that is typically intended to be worn on the user's back. We've also established two different classes, and Dan can get into more of this a little bit later about a self-retracting device that is intended for above the D-ring locations, whereas others that can be used either above the D-ring or below the D-ring. And I really got to congratulate Dan for pushing this through as far as making sure that all manufacturers that meet the ANSI Z359.14 standard are forced to increase the strength of their devices by at least 20%, so we can meet the 2-to-1 expectation. So great job on that, Dan, and I'm sure you'll incorporate that into some of your other which kind of goes into another discussion as far as oftentimes we get questions on the committees about the differences between twin leg lanyards and personal SRLs, and you see a couple of different examples here on the screen. And oftentimes people are just simply caught with a short phrase that the SRL is a safer alternative to the lanyard. And I know that Adam has some very, very strong thoughts on that we'll get to a little bit later, and Dan can share some of those items from a manufacturing perspective also. We also want to just let everyone know that the full body harness Z359.11 came out with some new changes. They weren't significant changes, but the standard hadn't been revised in about 7 or 8 years, and so it's coming out. Rob Willis from MSA Fall Protection is the chair of that, and he is busily working on a revised draft that'll be coming out in the near future. So someone says my audio is cutting in and out. Is it improved, or do I need to call in? How's that?
It seems to be improved, but I will keep you posted.
Okay, great. If it needs to, I can jump on the phone and we can try to arrange something like that. But in all sincerity, I'm not going to be doing the most talking, so these other folks are. So we'll get to those questions. So with that, let's go ahead and get to a couple questions. I'm going to go back a couple slides to the Z359.14. Dan, just a fundamental question, and we actually addressed this during our past Z359 full committee meeting. Does the new Z359.14 2021 make some previous equipment non-compliant? Dan, can you jump on that, please?
Thanks, Thom. And to answer your question, I know that this is a concern for a lot of people in the end user community. Once the standard takes effect in February of 2023, then the expectation is that any manufacturer that manufactures new product that is marked as compliant with the standard shall meet all of the requirements of the standard from that point forward. The functional question for the users in the field is, what do I do with all the products that I bought historically, as late as December of 2022? And the answer to that question is, so long as your product is in serviceable condition, meets all of the inspection criteria established in your manufacturer's instructions, then there is no reason why you can't continue to use that product and expect it to perform, provided you're using it in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Now, if an employer wants to avail itself of the latest technologies, of the newest protections available in a standard, then it's absolutely your prerogative to upgrade your fleet at that point and buy new products to conform to the new standard. But there's no legal requirement on your part to do so. So what the standard does is it represents a change and a shift in the state of the art, the things we understand about these products, and the things that we can make them do and reasonably expect them to do. And so we've introduced some new protections. And if you're interested in availing yourself of those protections, then by all means, take a look at what's becoming available to you in the marketplace and make a decision as to whether or not the fleet you have is going to sustain you, or whether you want to avail yourself of some products that protections and capabilities you may not have at your disposal right now.
Thanks, Dan. I've switched my audio to the phone, so if that continues to cut out, please let me know through our text messages. Adam, obviously, working as a contractor that, you have a lot of product out there. You've worked for, a number of different organizations. Can you share a little bit as far as, some of your best practices in the past as far as how you would switch out equipment? What's the typical best practice? What are some practical items versus what you need to do? Adam?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom. My recommendation would be to, absolutely in line with Dan's. And I say, you just follow your typical inspection processes with your daily inspections and your quarterly inspections of the gear. And then just sort of, as you move through that equipment and phase that equipment out, based on use, damage, et cetera, then phase the new stuff in. But I think the ultimate question here is to ensure, no matter which brand of it or which whether it's sort of pre-standard, revision or post revision, that your employees are using the equipment correctly and in an environment per the manufacturer's recommendations, but that puts themselves in the best position that if they are to experience a fall, right, that they would get through it successfully with the right equipment.
Great, thanks, Adam. Mike, anything that you'd like to share relative to this, a new standard and how your folks in your organization, obviously you're dealing with a lot of different contractors out there, and so you've seen a lot of best practices, you've seen a lot of things where you've had discussions with them. What can you add as far as how you phase in equipment, realizing that this doesn't make the old equipment non-compliant, but you still want to phase it in? What can you share on that, Mike?
Sure. I think a number of our contractors and our captive group are excited about this change, and they've seen some difficulties with the old technology and the old standards, and previous capacity going from 282 pounds up to 310 pounds. They're looking forward to having more robust equipment that's going to survive in more situations. So, as they get onto the market, I think they're going to start getting snapped up by our folks.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate you sharing that. Next question that we want to go into, and again, thank you very much for all these questions that you've sent in, and continue to send in the questions. I know we have a couple others that have been chatted in, and we'll get to those shortly. But Dan, I'm going to start with you on this question. Somebody typed in, we have begun to purchase leading edge Srls for use on our steel and precast concrete erection. My resources state OSHA does not yet require LE Srls and only recommended. Is that correct? That's the first question. The second question is, can you explain sharp edge Srls now in the same, relative to the same question? So again, first question is does OSHA require them? And the second question is giving a little more detail about sharp edge Srls. Dan, can you start with that, please?
Yeah, let's start with the question with regard to the regulatory expectation established by OSHA. And there isn't any. And OSHA, in the regulations published that cover fall protection, whether in subpart M, D, or I, don't recognize or acknowledge or utilize the nomenclature of leading edge SRL or SRL-LE. So as a result, there are no requirements for their use, no stipulations, and no preferences. Furthermore, if we look at basic OSHA regulatory requirements for fall arrest products and fall arrest systems, there's an expectation that the use of a fall arrest system shall limit the user's free fall exposure to 6 feet or less, which a leading edge SRL is not capable of doing. So it's really outside of the scope of the OSHA regulation, and it's something that's going to be managed by exception in the eyes of OSHA, generally speaking. Now, if we look at the phraseology or the nomenclature and the difference between a leading edge and a sharp edge device, there isn't any. And the phraseology around sharp edge SRLs is a marketing tool and has no basis in standard or regulation. There are no specific requirements, designations for sharp edge products in the Ansi Z359 code, nor are there any test procedures to evaluate the efficacy of those products. And when we see a sharp edge product being offered or marketed, it's generally on the basis of a leading edge product, but oftentimes is characterized as having some other additional protective features which may or may not necessarily be the case. So I'm going to kind of stop short on that and say that if you're looking at a quote unquote sharp edge product, I'd ask some very, very tough questions about what makes it a sharp edge product, because again, there's nothing in the OSHA regulations and nothing in the Z359 standards that even discusses the phenomenon of a product of that type.
Mike, if I could come to you next, just for some clarity, when it comes to these testing situations, because, as we all know, being on the ANSI committee, is that it's only a steel edge that's used for the test. And so some people might think that these devices are indestructible, right? They can destruct. Just from your experience, have you seen devices that, quote, pass the test, but have still failed? Obviously, you've seen them in a variety of circumstances, but anything that you can share as far as, what, just because it passes a test doesn't mean it's indestructible? Maybe just answer that last question there.
Sure. No, absolutely. We've seen even high quality products from major manufacturers fail. In situations that fall outside of the testing requirements of Z359, they are not abnormal on a job site, and that relates to edges other than the steel, singular steel edge that is required by Z359. So we've looked at testing with concrete, vertical edges, and we've checked out the possibility of some other edges, but yeah, they get bound up rather quickly, and depending on the characteristics of the constituent line of the lanyard, we saw a lot of problems and mismatch with synthetic webbing and our concrete edges. But certainly we are recommending now to our contractors, that we've seen an evolution from being excited about SRL products on the market and everything that we thought they could do, and then seeing the limitations with synthetic and moving over to steel, and then leading edge rated products and all that. But we see now that it needs to be tested for your application and the type of work that you're doing. It needs to fit the situation at hand.
Thanks, Mike. Adam, I want to switch over to you, and I'm gonna switch the slides here, because I know you've had discussions with this before in a variety of areas that you're involved in the industry. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is Dan mentioned, the tensile strength. Previously, it was 3,000 pounds for an overhead SRL, but compared to an energy absorbing lanyard, it was 5,000 pounds. And it was, the self-retracting device was often sold as the quote safer alternative. And I think we'd all agree in an overhead application, the self-retracting device would be the safer alternative. But as a contractor, that's not always what you're dealing with. Can you give a little bit, as far as when somebody broaches a topic that SRLs are always the safer alternative, can you kind of share what thoughts you have in that discussion with them to share? It's not as black and white as that, Adam?
Yeah, Thom, I feel like, sort of daily, or, having the conversations about, I just want a one size fits all, approach to fall protection. And the truth is that just doesn't exist, especially in a contracting space and in an industrial contracting space. Employees have to be in a lot of different scenarios and situations and structures, and a one size approach just doesn't accomplish the overall mission. And so, the SRLs, the back mounted SRLs and wearables in the past have sort of been sold as the one size fits all, and the truth is they're just not. And to your point, they aren't a inferior or bad product. In an overhead application, I don't think you can get in a better situation. But in a situation where you have to tie off at waist level, or sometimes even beneath that, you can get into some real sticky spots and some bad situations if that apparatus were to be exposed to a fall. As we mentioned, I think the real opportunity maybe isn't the type of edge that the line or the the lanyard would come in contact to. I would say that it's the, you know, the fact that you know, the line is coming into contact with the edge at all. And so I would recommend looking at some sort of fall restraint system that keeps them away from the edge, versus, you know, really focusing on the line and what in the edge it's coming in contact to. If you're in a fall restraint situation or you're in an overhead tie-off application, you'll never have to worry about that line hitting the edge.
Yeah, Adam, thanks for sharing that. And if anybody's heard Dan Henn talk before, you know, beyond saying visualize your outcomes, his second phrase is usually elevate your anchorage. So Dan, thanks for the short but very powerful statements. Let's go into another quick item. Dan, I think this will be a very, very quick question, and I don't think this question is coming from a nationalistic standpoint, but maybe just from a clarity. Do Srls made in foreign countries meet Ansi Z359 standards? And Dan, you know, in that question, I think there's maybe two other sub-questions. One is just a yes or no on that first question, but then, you know, what can the user do to make sure that their devices are, you know, fit for service out there, you know, just from any manufacturer, regardless if it's, you know, a device that's manufactured overseas versus manufactured here. And that kind of goes into what Mike shared a little bit ago about, you know, having conversations with your manufacturers. Dan, can you kind of answer that question with a yes or no, and then go into a little bit more detail as far as what folks should ask the equipment manufacturers? And being an equipment manufacturer, you're the person that's probably gotten those conversations before. Dan?
So with respect to whether or not imported products meet ANSI requirements, on a yes or no basis, my answer would be maybe. And what I mean by that is that for a Z359 rated product to qualify, it must be tested in an accredited laboratory and meet all of the requirements of the standard. And many times products manufactured here or elsewhere or anywhere will indicate that they meet the Z359 requirements. And they may even have legitimate testing credentials from an accredited laboratory to accompany those. One of the shortcomings I've seen with a lot of products, both domestic and import, is that in many cases, laboratories are doing the testing on the product, but they're not necessarily evaluating all of the requirements of the standard, which include design and material requirements. They include instructional and marketing requirements and a variety of other more semantic issues that are still functionally important to the user. So the only way you're really ever going to know whether or not a product you have conforms to the standard is to have a very direct relationship with your manufacturer and ask tough questions and make sure that you're asking for data. And more importantly than that, I would say make sure that you're procuring systems and products that are appropriate for the work you're doing and the hazards that you're facing. I think Adam and Mike have both made references to this, that, you know, in a circumstance or in a society where we become very, very PPE reliant, a lot of times we think that we're safe because we have the PPE. And just being tied off doesn't mean that we're not going to get hurt in a fall. So we really need to take a look at all the variables that are involved here in terms of our craft, their skill levels, what they've been trained on, where they're working, what hazards they're exposed to, and make sure we're matching the solution to the problem. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to get good results. And, you know, in terms of the standards conformance, that's a very important benchmark, and it helps us to understand whether or not this product has been built to minimum expectations and basic institutional and industrial knowledge. But how is this going to work for you? And that's really going to be, in my mind, the bigger question for the consumer.
Thom, can I add to that?
Please jump in.
I would also say that, you know, in addition to obtaining the test data, you can request videos from the manufacturer for the testing that they did. I think a number of them do record those, or witness it yourself. You know, perhaps you've got again, to go back, you know, a particular application that you're interested in, you can simulate that test at a manufacturer's facility. But those are things that you can ask about and talk through to make sure that you're confident with the answers you're getting.
Great, thanks for bringing that up, Mike. Adam, you want to jump in, because it sounds like you've done things like that in the past too. How do you have that conversation? And I know that one thing you've also done is you've had people say, hey, if you're having trouble get that information, you know, talk to someone on the ANSI committee, and maybe we can help facilitate that conversation. Adam, what would you like to add?
Absolutely. I just want to say, make sure everybody understands that your relationship with your manufacturer is absolutely quintessential to the success of your fall protection program. I mean, if you are reaching out to your manufacturer of choice and asking for their testing data, asking questions, and you're receiving answers like, no, we don't make that available to our customers, or no, I can't give that to you, things like that. I mean, I would tell you that you should maybe take a hard look at who you're buying fall protection gear from. I think that any manufacturer, and by the way, they all are used to this question. All of the really reputable ones are very used to this question, and they're amazing at it. And so they'll be happy to provide it. But if you're getting that answer, then maybe you should look at who's providing your fall protection and where you're purchasing that from, because you're the customer in this situation. And I know we all have customers in our business, and if you could just imagine telling your customer no, I mean, you would never do that. And so I can tell you that with the particular manufacturer that we buy fall protection from, we're constantly at their facility. We do testing. They're so open to us. It's just amazing, and the partnership is absolutely quintessential to the success of your overall program. And at the end of the day, right, your employees experiencing a fall in fall protection equipment, knowing that it's going to catch them, we got to put them in the best possible situation. So make that relationship strong. Ask all pertinent questions and get all data.
Thanks, Adam. Just want to look at the chat box real quick. There was a question that was brought in. Isn't sharp edge defined as less than a 0.005 radius? Dan Henn chatted in, no, the 0.005 radius is the Z359 requirement for leading edge SRLs. Sharp edge is not a term used in the ANSI standard or OSHA regulations. And so just really clarifying what that, how that item is there. Again, there is no definition for a sharp edge, but there is a definition for a leading edge test for that. Guys, I got one more question when it comes to self-retracting devices before we move on and get broader into other topics for questions that have been chatted in. Dan, I'm going to start with you on this one. SRL labels and shock pack covers can you easily prematurely damage, scuffed, etc. on an otherwise brand new device, such as a self-retracting device, leaving the only option send it back for refurbishment. Can manufacturers design built-in protections, replacement covers, etc.? Maybe make that a little broader. What do you do to make sure that just because you brush it against something, people aren't going to have to take these things out of service? What do you do as a manufacturer to help build that robustness into your product, Dan?
Well, from the manufacturing perspective, there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of making sure that the label material is selected for resistance to abrasion, ultraviolet degradation, and other environmental and behavioral hazards can be subjected to. There are other design features that can be built in, particularly on an SRL case, raised edges and different elevations on the surface of the housing to better protect some of those features. A lot of times on textile type energy absorbers, we may have covers and other envelopes and protective measures to help manage some of those expectations. But, I would say more importantly than that, there are two other things that come into play here too. Number one, let's remember that the labeling preserves the pedigree and traceability of a product. So it's important that we're maintaining that, for our own understanding. And so if we do have any difficulties, we can go back and, execute a thorough root cause analysis. The other part of that is that these labels and other materials will contain some of the most crucial warnings and instructions relative to the use of these products. And of course, if we look at the physical space available, we can't include, an entire instruction manual necessarily on the face of a product. So if it's actually written on a label or attached to the product in some way, we have to assume that it's one of the more important things the manufacturer is trying to disclose about that product. Finally, I'll say that, these are all pieces of life-saving personal protective equipment. And if we're handling them roughly, then, are we really respecting their true purpose? These things are costly and we're depending on them to preserve life and limb. So we need to manage them just a little bit differently than we might some of our other work equipment or tools. And if we do that, we're probably going to get some better results. But in terms of being an inspection point, these are critical elements, very important parts of the product. And if they're no longer serviceable, then I would contend that the product isn't either. And either the manufacturers need to attempt to do a better job of protecting these elements, or we, as the owners of that equipment, need to do a better job of taking care of those elements.
And Dan, maybe I can make a blanket statement, just like other products that we have in our lives. Some products are actually better designed than others, and that's why, you know, getting back to Adam's point as far as having that relationship with your equipment manufacturer will allow you to better judge and give feedback to them, and if not, if they don't make the changes, go on to a different manufacturer that might be able to better serve you. Great. Guys, I'm going to switch to a kind of an open-ended question. This is one that, you know, we all get hit up with this question every once in a while, so there'll be a variety of answers. But Adam, I'll start with you. What is the best outside-the-box solution to a fall protection issue you've ever seen? So, Adam, I know you've seen, you know, street and bridge, you know, the heavy civil, the industrial, the commercial contract. You've seen a variety throughout your career. Just you know, share something that comes to top of mind. Obviously, you know, there's probably 5 that you can name, but, you know, come up with 1 or 2 that you want to share with the group to help them think about other ways they can better protect workers at height.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty interesting question. I've seen a bunch. I think maybe one of the most sort of out of the box and interesting applications might be, you know, this is obviously several years ago, but it used to be somewhat common practice, but it's in today's world, it would be a little interesting. But where you're tying people, you know, where there's no overhead, you know, Anchorage or Anchorage to speak of at all, and you have a fall hazard. You've seen people tie off to crane hooks as a real kind of outside of the box solution. There is a number of vast opportunities that come along with that. Controls have to be really crucial, but yeah, that would probably be number 1 on my list.
Thanks, Adam. Mike, I'll switch over to you. Any thoughts that you have as far as outside the box solution to fall protection issues you've seen? Mike?
Yeah, one that came to mind was one that Thomas put in the chat regarding airbags or inflatable fall protection. I've seen those demonstrated at trade shows. I think that's you know, definitely fits the bill for outside the box. And another one I'm really intrigued by is the integrated vertical lifeline or single point lifeline, rope grab, whatever you want to call it, for, you know, residential roofers. They've integrated airlines into some products, and I can't speak to the efficacy of those, any of those at all. Haven't done any testing to evaluate if they're legit or not, but it's great to see manufacturers are thinking about those folks because they could use some help.
Great, thanks, Mike. Dan, we'll finish up with you. What are your ideas for the most outside the box solution to a fall protection issue you've seen? Dan?
Well, in all honesty, and I've got no skin in the game, so please keep that in mind. 2 of the major manufacturers of mobile elevated work platforms have developed and are offering as an accessory to their vehicles a clamp-on system that basically attaches to the top rail of the man basket that functions as an excursionary anchorage on those vehicles. And what excites me about that is, based upon the way those aerial lifts are tested and what they're capable of bearing in terms of fall arrest loads, I see a lot of long-term innovative applications where these can become solutions to problems that we frankly have a difficult time solving right now, whether we look at using them as sky anchorages or otherwise setting ourselves up to put an elevated anchorage someplace where we wouldn't ordinarily have access to it, and making this access tool that we have with the MUP far more versatile in terms of solving our work at height problems.
Yeah, just as a reminder, there's a lot of regulation portions, standards portions that we can't get into the details. So hopefully you'll take that answer, obviously, see how it can be applied at your site and make sure that you follow all the regulations and standards to make sure that that's implemented in an effective way. Next item that I want to go into is talking about discussing the first up and last down. So it says, please discuss first up and last down. Now, my understanding is that they're looking at how do you address the first person up and then the last person down when you're in a fall protection issue like that. So Dan, can I start with you? First person up type systems, what can you share as far as the availability of that product to protect that first person going up and then the last person coming down when maybe there isn't fall protection up there at this point? Dan?
Well, first thing I'll say as a disclaimer is that, in the Ansi Z359 code, particularly in Z359.2, we have a hierarchy of controls that's described in there. And so when we're looking at, entering an area where there are fall hazards or work to be done, if we can introduce some engineering controls and, mitigate those hazards as opposed to relying on PPE, that's obviously going to be a far better alternative. Where first man up concerns exist and we're not able to solve them through some other engineering or passive system implementation, then we're going to have to rely on some kind of PPE fall arrest system. And most manufacturers have an offering of remotely operated Anchorage systems that can be affixed and allow somebody to transition into these areas until more effective measures can be put in place. And that's not a tremendously difficult problem to solve because there's a wide variety of products out there for that purpose. A little bit more difficult to execute that in reverse order because generally speaking, what we're looking to do is solve the problem of the fall hazard, not necessarily look for dismantling it after the fact. So you're not going to see a whole lot of things that are easily retrievable. So if we're looking at having those temporary means of access, we're still going to be better if, we can go back to the hierarchy of controls and, for example, use an aerial lift to get in and out of that area rather than trying to rely on PPE. Each circumstance is going to have its own unique challenges, so it's not going to be real easy to identify, a specific menu of options. This is where the involvement of the qualified and competent person become real important in terms of executing our fall protection program and understanding that as work progresses, particularly in a construction environment, our needs might change over time. So we might have to regroup and develop different solutions as those things happen.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. We did have a question come in. Looks like George was asking, what is an Srlp? Dan was just looking at a couple of Srlps here on the screen, and then I'll go to this previous screen with this Srlp. Can you just give a 30 seconds on what an Srlp is, Dan?
Yeah, the Srlp, or self-retrenching lanyard personal, is a device that we are now defining, discussing, and testing within the context of the Z359.14 standard. And this is, generally speaking, a miniaturized SRL that is typically worn on the user's full body harness in lieu of the traditional energy absorbing lanyard. Oftentimes they're referred to as yo-yos and colloquially as fall limiters, and there are some other trade names for them. But Srlp is the official standards nomenclature. We developed that device, which is pictured in the lower right-hand corner of this slide here.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to move a couple other slides just to kind of use some pictures that we might be able to talk about. But Adam, I want to switch over to you. Building off of what the question was to Dan as far as the first person up, the last person down type situations. In your role in construction, you're often dealing with where there is no anchorage that's available. So the person typed in a question, what do you do when there is no good anchorage point? Dan alluded to a couple items, but just with your construction background, Adam, can you go into maybe what you've seen done, and then also what's your process for evaluating, do you have a good option when it comes to an anchorage? Adam?
Yeah, I think where this is maybe most applicable, especially in the industrial construction space, is around steel erection. And just like you would for building a structure or building or whatever you're working on, you go through an engineering for safety kind of work process, and do the same with your steel erection. And so some of the applications or some of the things that we like to do is mount mount scaffold ladders on your vertical beams while they're still on the ground, and then fly them into place that way. You know, start erecting your horizontal height. You can't do it in all applications, depending on the beam size and where it's going, but you can start putting your stanchions on, and in some instances, put your horizontal lifelines in place while the beam's still on the ground, so that when you fly those first couple beams up, your folks that are headed up there, you know, everything's already right there in place for them, and then they can just expand on it from there.
Great, thanks, Adam. Appreciate that. Mike, what do you do? Just, you know, thinking of some of the circumstances where you're out in the field with your contractors, thinking about, you know, they'll come up to you and say, you know, Mike, we don't have any good options for anchorages here. What kind of process do you take them through to start talking about, either for the current projects that they're dealing with, and maybe get into an example where maybe it's a future project that they don't have anything yet in place, but they have the time to pre-plan? Mike?
Right. So a couple other things I would probably, you know, think of and mention is, you know, remote anchoring poles that allow you to reach a tie-off point without having to expose anyone during the time, you know, that's being established. And then, you know, starting, you know, if we're talking fall arrest, if that's what we have to do, then, you know, you can establish an anchor point at the point of access, and then as you work your way out, those anchorage points would move along with the work and extend out. But to your point, yeah, with future projects, I would add that if you don't ask for these things, you're probably not going to get it. You know, because OSHA has that exception, you know, for establishing and taking down anchorages, and you know, passive fall protection and things of that nature. But if you want something different, if you're expecting 100% tie-off or 100% protection beyond just while work is being executed, then that should be included in pre-construction discussions and contracts and things like that, so that subcontractors and trade partners can plan for that.
Great, thanks, Adam. We do have a question coming about swing exposures, but I've asked Jess to kind of clarify exactly what he's looking for on that. So we'll get to that one in a second. So Mike, that leads to a nice question that we also got chatted in before the session started. Is what are your recommendations for below the tie-off, below the shoulder tie-off? So now our anchorage, rather than being overhead like Srls historically have already been, some manufacturers are really, it seems to be pushing foot level tie-off. So as our anchorage starts to drop, what are some recommendations? Obviously, you've seen equipment that's tested below dorsal D-ring. You've seen some videos as far as what can happen to a person when they go through a foot level tie-off. Can you give some recommendations there, Mike, for the folks to think about?
Sure. You want to make sure that you have the correct equipment, first of all, because you know, if it's not a leading edge rated or the new class 2 with the 2021 standard, then employees are going to be put at risk, because if it's a standard SRL or non-leading edge type unit, then it's only tested in that overhead configuration, and so you're kind of stepping out into no man's land with your usage, and you know, the manufacturer hasn't tested for that situation necessarily. Maybe you got lucky and it was designed for it, but it's not a guarantee. So I would look there first. And you know, Adam made a great point earlier that if you can get it above that level, then you avoid the exposure of the edge and everything else that comes with it.
Great, thanks, Mike. Adam, if I could move on to you, any other recommendations beyond what you shared earlier as far as when you have to consider that foot level tie-off, or not foot level tie-off, but at least below the dorsal D-ring tie-off location? Adam?
Yeah, it's really more of just a comment. You know, I think what's sometimes missing from our fall protection programs is a real healthy assessment of what our actual anchorages are and where they're located. I think that, you know, sometimes we get to a sense where you know, we're just happy that we have everyone tied off, and so where a below, you know, a at the waist or foot level tie off maybe isn't absolutely necessary because it's the last item. It's just what we've gotten comfortable with. So I would just encourage, you know, everyone to have a good program with their frontline supervision or whomever you deem your competent folks on site to do a real healthy assessment of what the anchorages are, where they're located, and then set clear expectations for your employees about where they're allowed to tie off and where they're not.
And then the other elephant in the room, I failed to mention was fall clearance. You know, if you don't have it overhead, then you're going to be needing to have quite a bit of clearance, and in a lot of cases, you know, say multi-story construction. I mean, typically you're not dealing with more than 14 feet. And a lot of times it's quite a bit less than that. Yeah, you have to visualize your outcome, and is your system going to be effective?
Dan, could you go and just maybe peel that onion back another layer as far as the clearance issues? Because oftentimes, you know, again, for the previous 2014 standard, people would say Class A, Class B. If I have a Class A device, you know, my device is going to lock up in 2 feet, even if I'm using it at a foot level. Can you debunk that, Dan? Just kind of spend a little bit more time talking about clearances, just so everyone realizes that you know, the Class A, Class B don't deal with the foot level, the clearances associated with the foot level tie-off. Dan?
You're really playing with fire here, Thom, because there's only 40 minutes left, and I could spend the next 40 minutes talking about this. But I digress. Let's start with that.
Give me your best 3 minutes, Dan. Your best 3 minutes.
Let's start with that Class A and B expectation in the historical standard, okay? Those metrics are derived from a test that has 0 free fall. The anchorage is elevated, the Srl's attached, we pull out 3 feet of line, we attach it to the test weight, we drop it. There's no free fall. As soon as we release the test weight, we go into activation, we lock up, and then we decelerate. So there's no free fall happening in that event. Okay, it's always under the restriction or the tension of the line, and we have the opportunity for an immediate locking engagement. When we tie off below the dorsal D-ring, we're introducing an element of free fall that doesn't exist in the test from which we derive our Class A and B metrics. So once I introduce that free fall, I'm adding fall distance that's probably going to be in excess of that Class A arrest distance value of 2 feet. And so when I see people tying off with a quote unquote Class A device that's mounted low or below their dorsal D-ring, they still have this expectation it's going to stop on 2 feet because that's what the label says. That's one of the reasons why the standard has some problems and why we've gone back and revised it and have devised a new classification system, which again, I could talk about all day. But the simple fundamental best practice here is the higher our anchorage is, the better off we're going to be because it improves every measurable metric in fall arrest. And that's an absolute truth. And I'm not trying to sell you anything. That's just the reality. And if we don't have the ability to elevate our anchorage and make sure that we have enough clearance to safely arrest our fall, then we've got to go back to that hierarchy controls and find a better way of doing it. Because we're not going to get a good outcome if we let somebody fall far enough to hit the next lower level or some object in the fall path. That's why 40% of all injuries related to falls resulting in days away from work are injuries to our lower extremities. We're not tying off routinely enough, and we're not tying off high enough when we do.
Great. Thanks, Dan, for that 3 minutes of excellence. That was very good. One item that I know we've shared in the past is the video from John Corvo from Lighthouse Safety, who's been a long time Z359 member. He shares a great video of a mannequin in an orange jumpsuit, 310 pounds, dropping it, and you can see just very, very visually with the video where that worker's not going back. Now, it's not an actual worker; it's a mannequin, but that worker likely has, you know, either leg, hip, rib cage, shoulder, arm, possibly even facial injuries from that. So the mannequin doesn't hit the ground, but with that leading edge fall, there's a lot of items you need to keep in mind. So as safety professionals and others in the industry, we have to differentiate between the robustness of the Srl LE from the previous standard and our Class 2 Srl from the new standard, and the exposure. Getting back to that risk assessment that Adam mentioned, just to make sure that we do all that in the right manner. So great, thanks guys. Adam, do you want to add anything related to a foot level tie-off? And then I'll go on to Mike before we close out that question. But Adam, any other recommendations for when we're making a tie-off lower than our shoulder level?
No, sir, I'm all good.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Dan, this one is for you. Can you discuss self-rescue devices that provide methods to safely lower personnel to a lower level following a fall? And they're talking about devices that preclude prolonged hanging in place and the dangers of orthostatic intolerance. So maybe talk briefly about those devices, Dan, and then maybe something related to rescue plans. Dan Henn?
Well, regardless of what type of system or device we're talking about, we have to understand that they're probably only going to be useful or effective in those circumstances where the fallen user has not sustained a substantial injury. If they've sustained any kind of mechanical injury or are otherwise incapacitated, they're probably not going to be able to do much to help themselves out. So with that said, we kind of have a somewhat of a progressive hierarchy of rescue solutions that are kind of, focused at the end user. The first of which is going to be your suspension trauma relief strap or stirrup type assembly. And it's important to note that there are no standard or regulatory requirements or expectations established for these devices. So there's a pretty wide variety of different types and executions out there. Now, again, if someone has fallen and is suspended, these do offer a little bit of relief from orthostatic intolerance. And for somebody who's in reasonably good shape and uninjured, they'll be able to kind of change position and move around a little bit and keep the blood flowing while somebody is going to work on helping to get them down. When we look at self-rescue systems that are designed to change the person's location after they become suspended, unfortunately, we're really kind of restricted because it's not likely we're going to bring them back up to where they fell from. So we're probably going to rely on some sort of descent mechanism. And if that isn't built into their fall arrest system, then it's going to be requiring somebody to help facilitate that rescue. And even in those circumstances where solutions of that type exist, they're going to rely on a clear fall path or a clear rescue path beneath the worker, which we may or may not have. And then number two, we have to make sure that we've actually got enough line in that system to move them from their resting location following the fall down to a safe location below. So there are some deployable backpack style systems or secondary descent mechanisms built into SRL-R type assemblies. But again, they're going to be limited in terms of their usefulness, depending upon the geometries of our job site. So I would say probably the best thing we can do from the worker, from the standpoint of rescue, is actually to integrate that rescue plan into our comprehensive site-specific fall protection plan and make sure that we're looking at each and every fall hazard. And when we have a predetermined plan in terms of what we're going to do and what we're going to implement in the event somebody succumbs to a fall at that location. And, on a particular site or a different project, we may have hundreds of fall hazards, and each of those fall hazards may have unique rescue challenges. So the idea that we can look for a bag of rescue that we're going to be able to use in all circumstances is probably not realistic. We're going to have to take a toolbox approach to rescue, just like we do with fall arrest.
Thanks, Dan. Dan, we're going to kind of switch, or guys, we're going to switch bases real quick. There's a couple questions that came in to talk about, distance to an unprotected edge. So, Mike, I'm going to start with this one for you. It says, what is a safe distance from an edge with a 6-foot or greater fall to a lower level? And so I just want to give context before Mike answers. We do have an image similar to it on the screen, but the image on the screen is related to the subpart DNI for 1910, so the general industry regulation, talking about low slope roofs for more of maintenance type situations. This is one item that we always have to be conscious of, is that OSHA really looks at the task that you're doing versus who you work for to determine whether it's a 1910 or a 1926 exposure. And so the administrative control that they talk about that is mentioned in 1910 for using that administrative control 15 feet or more from the roof edge. So I just want to clarify that. But Mike, if you could look at it from a construction circumstance, what's the safe distance from an edge with a 6-foot or greater fall to a lower level? And if you want to mention a letter of interpretation or something like that from OSHA, feel free to include that. Mike?
Sure. So the general stance in OSHA that they mention, in the standard and preambles and letters and all that, is that there is not a safe distance from an unprotected edge or a leading edge. They give one exception, and this is kind of a fun fact that I like to stump people with sometimes, and I think I have it included in the chat here. But it's an old letter of interpretation from 1996 that talks about one scenario when you're on a very large roof, and when you have at least 50 feet away from an edge, from all edges on that roof, then as long as you have trained employees, distance can be your protection. Now I do recommend you think hard about what your access points are, and where you're loading and unloading, and having additional protection and measures in those areas. But they do allow that one exception for roofs. So now if your roof is smaller than that, then you need to be thinking about some more conventional methods, maybe supplementing your parapet, adding guardrails, fall restraint, fall arrest. Now, however, on a floor, I've never seen it acceptable to use distance as protection. So that's a floor under construction, or even somewhat structurally complete. Distance alone should not be your method of protection.
Great, thanks, Mike. And that's consistent with, I believe there's a case that some lawyers have written on the internet about the OSHA Review Commission, because I think the OSHA Review Commission looked at that relative to construction, where again, it has to, again, getting back to the assessment that Adam talked about before, it's based on the assessment versus any strict distances that OSHA has in there. Again, that there is no quote safe distance on an unprotected edge, and you need to based on the assessment. So Adam, I have an assessment circumstance that somebody typed in a question for you to give some thoughts on. So Adam, this question is: on a leading edge rooftop or parking garage, so they gave the two different options, parking garage sloping ramp that's in the process of being built, a red danger tape 6 feet from the edge around the perimeter, is that enough from the GC to allow employees to work without fall protection? So Adam, the proverbial red caution or warning tape, what's your thoughts on that, sir?
Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into creating a controlled access zone. A red caution, the red danger tape is commonly seen, and it is not a good practice at all. If you want to create a controlled access zone, the best way to do that is with some sort of rigid barrier to create that type of environment. Tape or something that can be easily passed under is not an acceptable application.
Great, thank you very much, Adam. Appreciate you chiming in on that. Dan, we have a question that's related to fall protection and working at heights, but believe it or not, it doesn't deal with a harness, a lanyard, or anything like that. So Dan, where can I obtain a new hard hat that has the most protection from falls? So really two questions. If you'd explain the first item, why do we need a hard hat when we're working at heights using fall protection PPE? And then answer the question as far as, what hard hats are the most protective from a fall. Dan?
I'd like to shake the hand of the person who asked that question. The BLS data isn't always necessarily the same body of data. In other words, sometimes it's a little bit more revealing than others. But in recent BLS data related to fatal occupational injuries, it's revealed that 1 out of 3 fatal falls is directly attributable to a head injury. 1 out of 3. And about 8% of all injuries requiring days away from work that are fall related are also related to head injuries. And fully 1/3 of those are traumatic in nature. So the worker at height really needs additional PPE apart from their fall protection, and the head protection is a critical element of that. And the BLS data is kind of showing us that. So with that being said, the ANSI body of standards has developed a head protection standard as well. And the Type 2 version of the hard hat conforming with that standard is one that is both top and side impact rated. So, our traditional construction hard hat that we think of, like, our dad wore, was really there for dropped object protection more than anything else. Somebody drops them in my head, it's going to hopefully bounce off and I'll walk away and not feel too much worse for wear. But under the circumstances we see people working at height, particularly in the construction market, once we fall, if that hat doesn't stay on my head, it's not going to do me a whole lot of good. There was a swing fall question came in a little while ago, and if we add that variable in, then that side impact protection becomes really important too. So I'm a strong believer in the idea that if we got everybody in the construction market to start wearing the Type 2 hat with a 4-point chin strap, we would probably eliminate a substantial number of the fall-related fatalities, and we may even eliminate a number of the worst injuries that we're seeing every year just by changing some of our PPE culture with regard to hard hats. An important footnote is that in wind energy and telecom, these are generally the preferred manifestation, and in Europe, the helmet or climbing style hard hat with the chin strap is the absolute norm, and they're not seeing the same magnitude of head injury and fatality that we are here. So this is a piece of fall protection culture that has nothing to do with fall protection PPE that is absolutely low-hanging fruit for us.
Dan, since you mentioned it, can you go ahead and go into George's question a little bit more? He had the initial question, can speakers address swing exposure? And when we asked him to clarify, he's talking about swing radius calculations exposure. So I think he's talking about, swing drop distance, swing fall, how that goes into clearances, and then maybe you could have a little tag on to, some figures that you championed at the end of the Z359.14 standard as far as what manufacturers have to do from a marking standpoint, because sometimes you're not using that self-retracting device right on, and you might have some sort of an offset related to that. Dan, can you spend a couple minutes talking about that, please?
Well, at the most basic level, when we're talking about fall arrest as a function of fall protection, the more variables we add to the fall event, the more unpredictable the outcome is going to be. Okay? So in a perfect fall, our anchorage is up here, my fall path is clear, and I fall on an axis straight up and down. And that's going to be the easiest event to predict and the best outcome I can possibly produce. But my anchorage is offset, and I introduce that diagonal line of sight between my connecting subsystem and my anchorage. Now I'm going to be falling in two axes, right? I've got the vertical fall, and it's going to delay the engagement of my system, meaning I'm building up more kinetic energy during that free fall phase. Once I create that fall arrest engagement, now I'm not only falling on the vertical axis, but now that I'm being leveraged by the hypotenuse in this illustration, I'm also now traveling on the horizontal axis, and I'm building up speed and force. So now there are more variables introduced that are probably going to put me in harm's way. So one of the things we've done, particularly with regard to point 14, and that we're trying to do with regard to all the product standards in the Z359 code, is we've introduced an end user guide in the final appendix in that standard. It is basically about an 8 to 10 page guide of basic do's or don'ts, best practices that includes a variety of illustrations and methodologies for calculating fall clearance and for helping to manage some of these variables so we can do a better job of visualizing those outcomes, as I talk about so frequently. At the most basic level, if we do a little whiteboard or white paper exercise, and if we observe work behavior in a field, if we just take the time to sketch out the person, the work that's being done, the hazard in the system, and then try and visualize what would happen if this fall actually took place right now, I think a lot of times we might be shocked by what those outcomes start to look like. So the idea is to try and equip people with some understanding of what a fall is going to look like and how to better manage these variables and reduce their severity. Because the more we can, confine the user behavior, the better off we're going to be in terms of the outcome and the predictable results of using PPE as a solution for our problems.
Great, thanks, Dan. I had a question chatted in from Mary Alice. Adam, I'm going to jump on to you after that. I'll give an initial answer, then I'll have you follow up with your thoughts on it. But it says from Mary Alice, when working from a sloping or steep roof, what should be the spacing between anchorages? Anchorage points. And so, Mary Alice, where I would typically start with that is I'd also have to know what kind of clearance distances, getting back to what Dan shared before, that's really going to be a key part of it. But then there's also a second factor as far as are they transitioning between anchor points, and how are they transitioning between anchor points? Because in some cases, they might just kind of like a window cleaner would, is they just kind of go down, kind of work their way down, and then they would kind of re-rig and then have a second point. So are they having a transition between anchorage points? And the reason why I asked that is I was reviewing a set of drawings a couple years ago for a hotel type installation. They had a metal roof on there, and between the anchorages that were at the ridge, they had about 50 feet between each of the anchorages. And so think about how they're using this. If they're at one anchorage and they want to go to the other anchorages, they're walking horizontally 50 feet. Well, getting down to the bottom of the roof was less than 50 feet. So simply just by falling before they get to that next anchorage, they're going to have, as Dan said, all that energy built up that is then going to put the system and possibly overload it from the amount of energy they're putting into it. And so a couple different factors. We have to look at it from a swing fall standpoint and not overdo the swing fall. We have to make sure that it's feasible as far as transferring from one anchorage to the other when they have to. And then there's a couple other factors that might go into play, but those are the primary ones that I think of. Adam, do you want to jump in and finish up anything on that question?
Yeah, and maybe I'm not clear on the maybe the whole question, but I would also say, anchorage points being one thing, but what is their fall protection system as a whole on this roof, right? Like, I mean, if we're looking at like an engineered fall protection system with lifeline type system or something like that, that would matter also on kind of how your whole approach to fall protection on the roof in general. What's the structural integrity of the roof, et cetera. How do you move forward? I think that's a good starting point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Adam, you bring up a great point. Is it a gable or a hip end? Because if you're at the end and you step off the edge there, obviously you could have a significant amount of swing fall. So great points. And again, it gets back fundamentally to what you shared near the beginning of the conversation, Adam. Making sure that assessment is in mind. I have another question that Mike, I'll come back to you. I'll give the initial answer on this too, and then Mike, you can follow it up. But it says, within how much time limit span a person should be rescued if free fall happens and the person is in a hanging condition with his full body harness on? What might be the consequence if he is not rescued within a prescribed time period? And so for that question, typically what I like to reference for people is two items. One is OSHA does have a safety and health information bulletin out there that says, if you don't rescue the person within 30 minutes or less, you risk a severe injury or fatality. So, boiling down their safety and health information bulletin to one statement that summarizes it. But there's also another resource from NIOSH, and they did a report years ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago. It was reported at an International Society for Fall Protection Symposium, and they mentioned that based on an analysis that they did, if you want to have a 95% certainty that there's going to be no long-term effects on the person that goes through a suspension, you need to rescue them within about 11 minutes. Now, if you only want a 50% chance or 50% certainty that there's not going to be any long-term effects, then you can take that full 30 minutes. And so that gives a little clarity as far as what OSHA based that 30 minutes on. Now, Ansi Z359 talks about having contact, either physical or verbal contact, with the fallen person within 6 minutes. And so there's a lot of different things that go into those numbers. Obviously, you need to have a medical evaluation to determine whether the person that could go through a suspension can even suspend that long. But that's really a secondary point that I think per this conversation. So hopefully we kind of scratched the surface with this. But Mike, can you maybe fill in a couple gaps as far as what other things you want to think about from a suspension standpoint, Mike?
Yeah. So is the 11-minute mark realistic? And there may be a number of resources you have to have at hand. I had a project that was we were doing some work towards the end of substantial completion, and all of our boom lifts had gotten taken off the site. Well, we had to call boom lifts back, get an operator to sit there while that scope of work was being performed in case someone suffered a fall and was left hanging. So it may involve investments like that, depending on the phase of the project. But yeah, think about the primary methods, and if there is some self-rescue or some suspension trauma relief that someone who's conscious can self-perform, that's fantastic. I was observing a fall rescue demonstration last week, and it was interesting because they popped out their trauma straps, and the employee climbed in to relieve the stress on his legs, and the trauma straps broke. And I just thought it was great that happened during a training and not during the real thing. So it was a great testimony for practicing before you have to do it.
Thanks, Mike. Dan, I'll come with you with a quick follow-up question that Mike made me think about. What requirements are in the Z359 any Z359 standards for suspension trauma straps? Can you give some clarity to our audience relative to what requirements are within Z359 for those? Dan?
Well, at the present time, there aren't any. There is some talk among the subgroups about whether or not to integrate these into one of the standards and which standard it would be best to incorporate that into, but it hasn't actually happened yet. So the suspension trauma strap products and systems that exist in the marketplace are not built to a standard or a regulation at the present time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that because it's a product that's innovative and it's intended to address a particular risk factor that isn't specifically addressed otherwise by the ANSI standards or the OSHA regulations. However, with that said, it's important to understand that each manufacturer who's developed a solution for that problem has developed that solution according to their own understanding. So you may find that there are some solutions that are more effective than others. So as Mike was saying, the idea that there's training going on out there and that there are some evaluations of these products being performed in situ in the field is a great idea, because it'll help us to determine which of these products are going to meet our expectations the best and which are going to be the most foolproof and which might be a little bit more difficult to rely on.
Thank you very much, Dan. Kind of a round robin, or not a round, but around the horn question I want to do for this. But Mike, I'll start with you. How do we implement preventing hazards through design? So what can be done to address these hazards? Again, trying to move practices and processes upstream so that we can we don't have to deal with these issues out in the field. I know it was a big discussion with a construction management group I was with over the weekend, talking through the Z359.2 standard. Mike, what are a couple things that you've done in working with your contractors to move fall protection upstream to make sure you address the hazards as soon as possible? Mike?
Sure. One that comes to mind, everybody always talks about, designing parapets in. It certainly is frustrating when that's not included in the design. And even if you do get it into the discussions earlier, it may not be aesthetically pleasing to someone, and it may not get incorporated in the final design, but at least you're trying. One that I've seen is, getting your chases and duct openings for, say, a rooftop unit, things like that, getting those covered with steel mesh is a great practice. Engineering in tie off points, especially around large pieces of equipment, areas that are going to be difficult to work around and access. Think about those, but get your safety professionals involved. A lot of times they're brought in a little bit later in the process, but it's definitely worthwhile to include them. And just a plug for an upcoming conference, Arizona State is holding a prevention through design conference, and I just registered this morning. It was $30, and they've got a lot of great speakers lined up, so look for that.
Great, and just as Jess has put a couple things in the chat box, just as far as CPWR's construction solutions with prevention through design solutions. So thank you, Jess, for that item. And then Jess also put in the safety and health information bulletin on suspension trauma. So thanks for having the fast fingers there, Jess, and getting those loaded in. Adam, what would you like to share related to prevention through design? You know, what have you seen out there in the field, and what have you seen that's been effective as far as implementing that? Adam?
Yeah, I think there's really two things that I'll share around that. Is that you know, I think about sort of your elevated concrete pours where you've got these folks that are going to go put something in place that you know, currently the only thing that resides there is sort of air and opportunity. And so you know, when these structures are being built out with rebar and other things, you know, really making sure that your insert sleeves and things like that are put into the rebar and into the structure, so when the concrete pour is made, you already have your sleeves for your stanchion, your fall protection stanchions ready to go. And so you don't have an elevated concrete surface there with unprotected edges and no fall protection solution, and then you're just trying to figure it out then. So I think that's a real you know, interesting kind of prevention through design situation. And I think one that I think we'll start seeing a lot more of in the future is probably, I mean, we see it today, but when we build out structures, loop reactor structures, any kind of industrial space structures, I think in the future what you're going to see is a rigid rail system potentially designed into the build of the structure. And so when you install it, you install a rigid rail system too, so that your fall protection for that structure is already in place. I think that's something that's kind of you know, front and center, and I think that's going to take off pretty well. I think that's a real nice customer value, or a value add you can provide your customer along with their facility and their structures.
Adam, I'm going to stick with you because you had a nice closing to that answer about value add. And so one of the questions that came in was, with regards to policy communication and enforcement, what advice and insight do you have in navigating instances of being met with resistance from decision makers and policy influencers when updating existing policies or completely overhauling them? So kind of getting back to, you know, talking to your C-suite counterparts, thinking about, you know, how do you sell them on moving up the hierarchy of control, on prevention through design, you know, where value add is not only for your own organization, but also for the customer. Adam, can you spend a couple minutes, you know, unpacking that for us?
Absolutely. So, you know, I think that everyone sort of knows the climate or understands the climate at the place that they work. And so I would say the good news about selling safety, and especially around fall protection, is that there's nobody, especially in those C-suite offices, that want to hurt anybody. And so when you're talking to them about, most people just don't like change. It doesn't matter if it's, you know, value add or not. And so I would tell you the first part of your conversation has to be getting past the change factor. And once you get past the change factor, showing value for things, especially around fall protection, is relatively easy. And so working them through the conversation, helping them understand the value to the end user. I think once they get that, it's a done deal from there. So any other sort of opposition outside of that would just be sort of unhealthy, and for just for the reason of having an opposing opinion. So but I think ultimately it's the initial change factor that sort of, you know, people get hung up on, and just working them through that. I think also you don't, you know, way too often people say, well, I'm not going to go ask this question because I already know the answer. Go ask the questions. Go see if you can make that change. Just because somebody answered it one way 2 months ago doesn't mean that their mind hasn't changed today, or they can't be influenced differently today.
Great, thanks, Adam. And gentlemen, we're getting near the end. I do have one final question that I'm going to get to at the second, and just go around the horn for that. I have a quick one that I want to address. Somebody chatted in, what is the difference between a safety program and a safety policy? In general, what we're looking at from a safety policy is that's more of just the approach, the overriding principle, your overall you know, vision when it comes to your organization, whereas a safety program is all the training, the assessments, the abatement, the inspections, the long-term and enforcement and incident investigation, things like that, program evaluation of the entire program. So real quick answer for that one. And then as we go forward, one thing I want to share is that when you're thinking about making long-lasting improvements, and that leads me to, the last question leads me to this, is Z359.2, our managed fall protection program standard, is probably the most effective way to do that. And the great thing is that you can always increase the effectiveness of your organization using those plan, do, study, act cycles that Edward Demings talked about back in the 50s and 60s. And so the Z359.2 is really set up to help support you in doing that. And so as we also finish up, I just want to share that thank these guys not only for their time here, but also for their time on the Z359 committee and making sure that we're creating standards to reduce the number and the severity of fatalities. Because when we look at the fatality chart that we started the presentation with, we take that personally, and we know that it's up to us and others in the industry to really drive that item down. And so one thing that I just want you to think about as you're out there in the field, and I think it summarizes, everything that we're talking about from equipment standpoint, clearances, foot level tie-outs. But imagine every year on May the 22nd at precisely 10:15, and I'll share why I use the date May 22nd. All your fall protection, all your workers simultaneously tested their fall protection systems. What would happen? Are you good, or are you hoping that you're lucky? And the reason why I chose May 22nd is because on that date, that's when I got a phone call and somebody said that they had a fall at their job site and they were caught by a horizontal lifeline I designed. You talk about making your day, making you realize why the Lord put you on the earth. We found a life that day, and unfortunately with the statistics that we have out there, there's a lot more lives that we can save. So as we finish up, please feel free to reach out to us if we didn't get to your specific question. But the question, Mike, I'll start with you on this, is maybe just try to keep it to about 60 seconds. What's one fall protection program element that would help an employer make the most significant impact on preventing employee falls at their job site? Mike, what would you like to share relative to that final question?
Preventing, I would say, would be competent person design and training would certainly help with that. But preventing is in my mind kind of a slippery slope, because you're unlikely to be able to prevent everything. You're working with humans. People are going to still manage to make mistakes, despite your best efforts and planning. So you have to, account for that. That's why, we're looking at more robust, fall arrest lanyards and equipment to survive when people have a fall that they weren't planning to have. So I would say, prevent what you can, but also, plan for that failure, because it's going to happen.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Adam, move on to you. Oh, I think I lost Adam. Dan, let's go ahead and quickly go to you. What's one fall protection program element that would help an employer make the most significant impact on preventing falls at a work site? Dan?
I would say the aggressive utilization and implementation of the hierarchy of controls. In my day job, I manufacture active fall protection systems, and I'm telling you that the best thing you can do is run away from me. So if we can prevent or eliminate the hazard, that's going to be the best thing for managing our outcomes. If we introduce passive systems to prevent access, that's going to be our next best outcome. And then we're down into the utilization of active fall protection systems or relying on PPE. And I would say, quite frankly, that if the hierarchy of controls had a basement, that's where we'd keep all of the leading edge SRLs, under in a cabinet that said break glass in case of last resort. Okay. So that hierarchy of controls is really the key to improving outcomes. And then beyond that, we elevate our anchorages. We take the time to thoughtfully visualize outcomes and teach people to be situationally aware.
Great, thanks, Dan. I do have an update from Adam. Unfortunately, they had a lightning hit his hotel, so hopefully everyone there is safe. His computers got zapped as it was plugged in the wall, so sorry about that. Adam, please, hopefully everyone is safe there, and sorry about that. In closing, I'll share one item. It goes back to what Adam shared. I'll call on him a little bit, is the assessment, because without the assessment, nothing else happens, because you don't know where your issues are. And the best way to solve a problem is first make sure that you clearly identify where the problem is. Then that leads to what Dan shared relative to the hierarchy of controls that goes into what is really the needs assessment, to what Mike talked about, as having good, competent persons so they can properly supervise the work at heights. And so, as you can see, all these items are the continuum that we call the Managed Fall Protection Program. So with that, just want to say on behalf of Adam, Dan, and Mike, thank you very much for your time today and your interest in this category. It's somewhere that we're very, very passionate, and we appreciate you giving us 90 minutes of your time to help better protect workers at height. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Chris for some final words before she wraps us up. Chris, back to you.
Well, thank you. You guys blow my mind. Just incredible information shared. We really appreciate it. We appreciate your sincere invitation for folks on the webinar to contact you directly, as you are the experts. And we rely on you from CPWR quite a bit as well, and appreciate your help trying to keep workers safe. So my hope is that everybody who's participated in this webinar go out and participate in the rest of this stand down week, but try to keep fall protection front and center all year long, because we still have a lot of work to do. And gentlemen, really appreciate your time. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Chris. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.